Hello, class. We spent a lot of time talking about science and the nature of science. We also need to talk a little bit of something called pseudoscience. So we'll take a short 10-minute segment here and talk about pseudoscience. A pseudoscience is essentially something that presents itself as science but lacks one or more of those key characteristics of science. And it's rather difficult because the distinction between something that is science and pseudoscience is not always clear cut, and that sometimes it's hard to tell. And many times a pseudoscience is going to include aspects of some real science. So it can lure the person into thinking, hey, this is real science, when it lacks one of those fundamental characteristics. So here we've got a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon where Calvin is asking his dad, why does the sun set? And his dad says, well, it's because hot air rises. The sun's hot in the middle of the day, so it rises high in the sky, which certainly has some aspects of real science where hot air rises, but certainly not in our scientific understanding of why the sun sets or rises. So let's take a look at some characteristics of science, or pseudoscience. Pseudoscience is going to start out with a conclusion. Like, hey, there's ghosts that exist, as we see in this hallway picture down below. Obviously, a picture of a ghost, all right? So we're going to start out with a conclusion. Now, this is going to be compared to real science, which starts out with the evidence. What is the evidence? Can we use this to explain the world? And realize many times a pseudoscience also has motivated reasoning behind it. There's some sort of underlying incentive for that to be argued. So, for example, in the 1970s and early 80s, here's an ad that was latest report, leading doctors in the field of cancer research insist cigarettes do not cause cancer. Obviously, there's motivated reasoning here because of the cigarette or the tobacco industry wanting to make sales of their product. So another characteristic of pseudoscience that it's only going to try to support the main idea. It's going to not change those ideas even if there's overwhelming evidence. So we're not going to reject that idea despite what the evidence tells us. We can take a look at the cigarette example there. So it's not going to accept data, the evidence that's contrary to the central tenet. Great example, we can take a look here if you watch the show Ancient Aliens. Despite what the scientific evidence shows us, they're going to link things such as the building of the pyramids to ancient aliens being the cause for that. And it's only actually going to seek out evidence that supports it. So when we find an area that is only seeking supporting evidence, that also is likely a pseudoscience. In science, we attempt to reject or falsify ideas. This gets us kind of to our next line of evidence, where many times to recognize a pseudoscience is that it has a reliance on anecdotal evidence, personal testimonies, or personal observations. So if we take a look at, say, the Loch Ness Monster, or Bigfoot down below, so we really need a tremendous amount of evidence behind these things. And oftentimes, a pseudoscience is not even going to be falsifiable. So could you prove that there's no Bigfoot? No, you can't reject that idea that there's no Bigfoot because we can't examine the entire planet. Or could you reject the idea that it was ancient aliens? No, you could not. So these things are by definition pseudosciences. Could you reject the idea that there are ghosts? No, you could not, because you can't completely examine this idea. Certainly beyond that, even if we want to accept ghosts, they're supernatural and by definition outside the realm of the natural world, which is the domain of science. So ultimately, when we're trying to take a look at some of these extraordinary claims, realize that to support them, they're going to need extraordinary evidence. Okay, so if you want to show me that Bigfoot exists, I need a body. Okay, I need remains. This is what we need, that extraordinary evidence. And that is going to be the ultimate data that we need. One of the risks that we run into is that in pseudosciences, people often say, well, the unexplained, therefore it's something other than science that's the cause. But realize because something is unexplained does not mean that it is unexplainable. Something that is unexplained at this time, we may discover the natural explanation for it at a later date. And certainly this has occurred multiple times throughout human history, human evolution. Why is it that as humans are developing, do males' testicles start up way up in their bodies? What's that about? We can actually explain that very clearly through evolution, as we'll do later on in the course. So a great example of this debate between science and pseudoscience, a couple years ago, Bill Nye debated Ken Ham, who is a noted scientific creationist. So he's using a direct interpretation of the Bible to explain history. So the key question that distinguished which side was science and which was not was when both individuals were asked, what would cause you to change your mind? Ken Ham said, nothing. So that's showing us that scientific creationism is starting with an idea. There's no evidence in the world that would cause them to change the idea that the earth was created over the course of 7 days by God. So on the other hand, Bill Nye, in his arguments for evolution, scientific evolution, said evidence. If we had direct evidence against the evolutionary explanation for the diversity of life, that would cause me to change my mind. And that is the heart of science and the nature of science. Before we go, there's one other topic that I want to touch on, and that's something called denialism. Cartoons say they're denying reality one fact at a time. Denialism is the dismissal of claims that are generally accepted as being consistent with the evidence, whether that being in science or history. And in this, you're going to have groups that use persuasion to give the appearance of debate when really, based off the evidence, there's little or no debate whatsoever. So this is really evenly distributed, this idea of denialism, across the political spectrum. So on the left, you've got the idea that vaccines cause autism, for which we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars testing, and yet to have one research study indicate that vaccines or any of their components lead to autism, or that genetically modified foods are hazardous to people. There's no evidence to show that they're nutritionally any different than regular organic foods, or that big pharmacy is trying to create this great conspiracy to get people hooked on drugs to generate profits. On the right-hand side of the political spectrum, you've got your climate change denialism. Well, climate change isn't caused by humans, which scientifically we know that human burning of fossil fuels is the ultimate cause of global climate change. Or the denialism of evolution, which is a constant debate, which we'll explore a little later this semester. So when we take a look at denialism, one of the backgrounds of denialism that makes denialism easy is, well, people think, well, science is hard. It takes some effort to understand the world around us, and so they leap to the conclusion that it must be wrong. People like to find easy answers, simple answers. So they look to conspiracies, that maybe it was the federal government that caused AIDS, or that the Holocaust was simply a conspiracy behind it. Oftentimes there'll be fake experts that are brought up. Oftentimes people will actually be hired to present themselves as experts, or there will be a campaign to discredit experts or discredit people. Take a look at evolution. Certainly you'll read sometimes that, well, Charles Darwin, we got to worry about him because he married his first cousin. Realize that back in that day, that was a very common practice. Denialism will have a selectivity of facts or use facts out of context. So for example, about global climate change, they'll say, well, this place had a cold winter last year, therefore there's no climate change. Well, that's using some facts, but that's not what climate change is about. Climate change is not just one area or the local weather, that is the global climate as it is warming. The ultimate goal of denialism is to promote doubt, to sow doubt in the public so that there is inaction on a given area. And this is ultimately what we want to fight in science in our trying to raise the scientific literacy of the American populace, is so that we can have a good understanding of the science and therefore we can make educated decisions. So we'll touch on these things more in class, and thank you very much.